Right, well, welcome everyone to our Zowe office hours designed to focus on Zowe v3 for Zowe users. I'm Rose Sakatch, the Zowe onboarding squad lead, and I will be kicking off the session and joined by Adam Wolf, who is the squad lead for Zowe CLI, as well as the Zowe client SDK. If you are a Zowe extender and you missed the office hours series focused on extenders and extending Zowe, please visit zowe.org/v3 and you will find the recordings for that series on that page. This series will focus on specific Zowe components to ensure that we offer all Zowe consumers, and by that we mean installers, administrators, users, etc., a deeper understanding of v3. Adam, can you advance, please? Okay, so what we have planned is every Friday, we started the series last Friday on January 5th. We will host a session dedicated to a specific Zowe component. And we'll be following this schedule. As you can see today, January 12th, we'll focus on Zowe CLI and the Node SDK. Next week, we'll feature the Zowe Explorer for Visual Studio Code, and so on. Next slide, Adam. And then for each of the sessions, you'll essentially find the same agenda. We'll open it up with a general overview of what to expect in v3 and some of the, well, first we'll go over the release timeline and give you some general information with respect to v3, v2, and v1. Then we'll go over what's new in v3 for the component or components that we're focusing in on. We'll talk about some installation configuration changes, if there are any. Then we'll have a discussion around what we expect the user to experience in v3, and then dive deeper into the specific new feature details that we're aware of. It is a continuous delivery release, so there may be features that we introduce with v3, but obviously there'll be more features as we continue on developing v3. And then we'll wrap it up with providing you with some additional resources, contact information, etc. I do want to encourage you to ask questions throughout, and if you would do so by using the chat, we will do our best to stay in touch with those. We'll address those as we go, if at all possible. In the event that we're unable to answer any questions during this hour or so that we have dedicated to this session, we will be sure to post them to our Zowe vNext page at zowe.org. Okay, next slide, Adam. Just going to go over a couple more slides and I'll turn it over to you. So Zowe releases important information. These are, we wanted to make you aware of a few dates, bring them to your attention, and the next slide we'll review it. We'll review it in timeline format so that you can plan accordingly. So we are planning to introduce Zowe v3 at the end of March 28th. We also are announcing the end of support date for Zowe v1. That will happen at the end of September this year. So for those of you on Zowe v1, you will definitely want to start to plan your upgrade either to v2 or v3. If you do plan on upgrading to v2, as you can see, you have a little bit of a runway there. We plan to continue supporting v2 through August of 2026. As far as compatibility goes, for those of you who are running Zowe v1 or v2 extensions, CLI plugins, for example, or Zowe Explorer extensions, APIs, we ask that you first verify that your extensions have earned Zowe v3 conformance if you're upgrading to v3. Alternatively, you could contact your vendor directly and ask them specifically if, for example, a V2 CLI plugin will operate appropriately and function without error in Zowe V3. As a side note, I want you all to be aware that all Zowe conformance support providers must reapply and reaffirm their conformance for Zowe V3. And the comprehensive support providers must support any new Zowe core components introduced in V3. And it's particularly important for this session because the client SDK, the Node.js client SDK in particular, will become a part of Zowe core, and therefore any comprehensive support providers will also be including support for that component. And next slide, Adam. And just again, to present the same dates in a timeline format, you can see that the first half of the year, we're focused on delivering Zowe V3. We'll be introducing Zowe V3 at the end of March. As I said, the final active release of Zowe V2 will also be delivered in March. We have that slated for March 4th. And then V2 will transition from an active release, meaning a release that continues to deliver features and functions, to a maintenance release, which is a release that will continue fixes and patches for any security vulnerabilities. And then again, at the end of September, that is the timeline for the Zowe V1 final maintenance release, and will terminate support. Okay, and with that, I will turn it over to Adam.
Okay, thank you, Rose. So a brief overview of what's changing in V3 for Zowe CLI. In terms of breaking changes, we have removal of V1 profile support, removal of the bright command, and an improved error message format. And I'll go into these in more detail on the next few slides. It's also worth pointing out that the supported Node.js versions have changed. We officially claim support for the current LTS version of Node. So since Node 16 is currently end of life, it's no longer supported. Going forward, Zowe CLI will support Node 18 and 20, which are currently LTS. So installation will be the same process as it was in V1 and V2. Users can enter the npm install-g at Zowe CLI command to get the latest LTS version from npm, which will be V3 once V3 is released at the end of March. You'll also be able to download the V3 Zowe CLI offline installation package from zowe.org and unzip the file, take the tar gz file, and issue the command npm install-g zowecli.tgz. Configuration will also be similar to V2, with the exception being that V1 profiles are no longer supported. So if you have not already made the transition to team config, which was introduced in Zowe V2, you can still use the Zowe config convert command to convert existing V1 profiles to a team config. You could also use the Zowe config init command to generate a basic Zowe CLI profile, and then manually add connection information to the resulting zoe.config.json. Finally, you could also use the Zowe config autoinit command if your system has the API ML installed. And there will be several changes to UX. I mentioned these earlier on the overview slide. And number one, we have the removal of V1 profile support. Essentially, you won't be able to use Zowe CLI V3 unless you implement a team config, and the Zowe profiles command group will be removed. Again, it's worth noting that the Zowe config convert command will still be available to help you convert v1 profiles to a v2 team config file. And then we have the removal of the bright command. Initially, Zowe CLI was called the Brightside CLI, and users would run commands by typing something like bright files create dataset, for example. It no longer makes sense to use the bright command to run Zowe CLI, so that ability has been removed in v3. So if you have scripts or other automation that invokes Zowe CLI using the bright command, you'll need to update those scripts to use the Zowe command instead. And finally, we have changed the error format to be clearer to users. However, if you use Zowe CLI in a pipeline or other automation that parses error output, you'll probably have to update your pipelines or scripts to handle the error message format introduced in Zowe CLI v3. And I'll go into the detail on the error format changes here. So we revised the error format in an attempt to make it clearer for users what exactly is going on and what they need to know. On the top here, we have a screenshot of the old v2 error format, and it lists the command error followed by a REST API error code, followed by some debug information, and then followed by more error details. So 3 different error messages with debug information in the middle, which can understandably be confusing. So we've reworked the format and added text coloration to clearly identify the actionable error message at the top in red, followed by the REST API error, and then followed by diagnostic information. And we think this should help users to more easily identify why their command failed and what they need to do, while still giving them all of the information they need. So beyond the items in the overview, it's useful to touch on a few more things in terms of Zowe CLI and v3. So due to incompatibilities with different versions of the IMS REST API, the IBM IMS plugin for Zowe CLI has been archived and will not receive future updates. The plugin will continue to be available via NPM, however, we don't recommend its use going forward. And it's also good to note that new enhancements after the release of Zowe v3 will only be implemented in Zowe CLI v3. And finally, scripts that don't include hard-coded version numbers or version tags for Zowe npm install commands will need to ensure that they're specifying a version of Zowe CLI that works with their configuration. Essentially, if your script installs Zowe CLI, when Zowe v3 goes live, the npm install at Zowe CLI command will install the latest LTS version of Zowe CLI, which would be v3, which won't support v1 profiles. So if you have v1 profiles, your scripts would not work properly unless you explicitly provide a version tag for the npm install command. So after the release of v3, we are planning to implement a few new features that are worth calling out now. The first is dynamic or interactive configuration prompting, and this was a highly upvoted enhancement requested on GitHub, and involves prompting the user for properties for a given profile in the user's config. For example, the user could issue the Zowe config init command to create a team config file and then run another command to be prompted for the host name, port, user ID, password, and so on. All of the properties you would see for a ZOSMF profile for Zowe CLI. This should make it easier than ever to get up and running with team config for new users. Secondly, we're planning to implement support for API-ML instance IDs. And instance IDs can be used to target a specific instance of a service through the API-ML. For example, if you're interacting with API-ML that accesses multiple ZOSMF instances on different LPARs, you could use the instance ID to target a instance of Zowe SMF on a specific LPAR for accessing the JES queue, for example. Finally, we're also considering the ability to support defining connections to multiple API-ML instances within a single team config file. And this is useful for users that have access to multiple API-ML gateways, either on multiple sysplexes or in a high availability configuration. The idea is to link a given service profile to a specific API-ML or base profile so that commands targeting a specific service profile are automatically routed to the desired API-ML gateway. It should be noted that it is possible with Zowe CLI v2 and v3 to specify the base profile as a command option. And since the base profiles are used to hold API-ML connection information, this option can effectively be used for this purpose. However, by linking service profile to API-ML profiles, users would not have to specify this option on every command. And yeah, so here we are periodically updating the vNext page on zowe.org with the latest information about changes planned for v3. And here you have contact information. Generally, the best way to get a hold of somebody from the CLI squad is to send a message in the OMP Slack server in the Zowe CLI or Zowe help channels. For bug reports or enhancement requests, please open an issue in our GitHub repository. And finally, you can also reach out to me directly if neither of the other options work for you. And for the latest announcements about everything to do with Zowe, consider joining the Zowe user mailing list at the link provided. And that's all for Zowe CLI. Are there any questions?
Anyone have any questions on Zowe CLI? Adam, I just wanted to make a comment related to something that you mentioned. So CLI users wanting to remain on V2 or upgrading to V2 need to be mindful of what they're downloading from NPM. That could be a gotcha if they don't specify what version they want of a plugin. Otherwise, they'll install v3. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, that's right. If you just issue the npm install @zowe CLI command, you will download the latest LTS version, which will be v3, which would be a problem if your plugins aren't compatible with that or if you only have v1 profiles.
Right. Okay.
But if there are no questions, I could switch over to the Node SDK presentation.
Okay. Sounds good.
I'll stop sharing briefly. So I think I'll move quickly through here. All of this information is the same as for the CLI up to the overview. Okay, so for those unaware, much of the functionality provided by Zowe CLI is available in a Node.js SDK, making it possible to build advanced scripts or Node applications, CLI plugins, VS Code extensions, and so on that interact with the mainframe. Changes to Zowe CLI also affect the client Node SDK. So with v3 mirroring the changes with v1 profiles in Zowe CLI, functions accessing v1 profiles will be removed or renamed. And we've also removed a number of previously deprecated items. and I've listed some of those in subsequent slides. I think we'll also post those, a definitive list somewhere else once V3 goes live. And again, we have Node 16 is no longer supported, and Node 18 and 20 are supported. So on this slide and the next slide, we have captured some of the deprecated items that have been removed, and we provide some suggestions on functions or constants to use instead. It's probably not worth going through each of these one by one, but you might find this information useful if you import the V3 SDKs and you find that your code breaks. I expect this information, again, to be captured elsewhere, but I'm not sure exactly where yet. This slide in particular talks strictly about imperative, which is the underlying CLI framework that powers Zowe CLI and contains functions for things like REST clients and profile management. And the next slide will cover the other Zowe client node SDKs like ZOS files, ZOS jobs, provisioning workflows, and so on. And so that's everything I have. I'll hand it back to Rose.
Hey, thanks, Adam. I also wanted to mention with respect to the client SDK, we will be introducing a new entry into the existing Zowe conformance program. So for those of you who are familiar with the Zowe conformance program, folks wishing to extend existing Zowe components such as Zowe CLI or introduce services that are compatible with the API mediation layer or apps for the Zowe desktop. The extenders participate in the conformance program to ensure that their extensions are compatible, interoperable, and deliver a similar user experience as others and in line with the intent of the Zowe component itself. In the case of the client SDK, this is essentially being introduced with V3 as a new core component of Zowe, and therefore we are also introducing a conformance program so that extenders could extend the respective client SDKs or perhaps introduce a new language client SDK. The Node.js SDK will become part of core, as I mentioned, but there are others that we hope to add to Zowe core, including Python and Java, for example. So you as a user of Zowe, if you're looking for interoperability with respect to any of these software development kits, please be sure to check the landscape, the conformance landscape, and look for the client SDK conformance badge, just like you would for any other Zowe extension. And then one final note with respect to conformance, the comprehensive support providers, so any vendor wishing to earn a support provider badge with respect to being able to showcase their ability to provide full support for all of Zowe core, the applicant must ensure that they are able to support any core client SDK. And that's a long-winded way of saying for Zowe v3, they will have to support the Node.js client SDK. Any questions around the client SDK, in this case, the Node.js or the conformance program? Or I think that brings us to the end, right, Adam, essentially? So any questions?
Yes.
Any questions for either related to the CLI, the Node SDK, or anything at this point? As we mentioned, this presentation, as well as the recording of this session and all of the prior and subsequent consumer office hours, will be posted at zowe.org/vnext. We will also post questions there as well, either from these sessions or questions that come in through other avenues. All right, not hearing any, not seeing anything in chat. So we will thank you for joining us today.